A brief warning before we get into the meat of this review. Warhammer End Times Vermintide requires you to have an internet connection at all times, even if you're going to be playing single player. Warhammer End Times Vermintide is a $30 melee-centric cooperative action game. This game borrows heavily from the mechanics of Left 4 Dead. Gameplay has you playing as one of 5 characters who have been trapped in the doomed city of Uberschreik. Your choices are between a dwarf, a soldier, an ember mage, an elf, and a witch hunter who go out on 4 participant missions in the city. The city, a once marvelous place, has been entirely overrun by a race of subterranean ratmen known as the Skaven, who are not a threat based on their individual combat prowess, but based on their massive numbers. Each of the game's maps and objectives are set in stone, but the places in which helpful supplies spawn, as well as where rats roam the particular levels, changes on each playthrough. You control a specialized character with a primary melee, a secondary ranged, and 3 slots dedicated to different utility items. If you've played Left 4 Dead, this should be all very familiar to you. The tone of Vermintide is quite grim. The city is war-torn, the color palette is dark, and while not featuring a great deal of classically beautiful sights, the game manages to impress me with its set pieces and presentation. The combat, which controls quite well, is unabashedly gory. You will cut down hundreds of Skaven in a mission, and they will lose arms, legs, and heads in that process. There is a checkbox to turn off gore, but if violence is a concern for you, this game is likely not up your alley. On booting up the game, you and whoever you're grouped with are dropped into an inn, where you can select your characters and gear up before going out on missions. Not all missions are available from the start. At first you can only see 9, but 4 more appear, bringing the grand total to 13 missions. Well, $30 for 13 missions, that sounds fair, especially considering that Left 4 Dead launched with 4 campaigns for twice the price. Well, these missions are not the length of a Left 4 Dead campaign. In fact, some are quite short, called side missions. They take about 15 minutes. Others are longer story missions, taking between 20 and 35 minutes depending on how well the run is going. Side missions, while shorter, tend to be more intense and have you fighting through nearly uninterrupted waves of vermin, gathering supplies or guarding wells, as opposed to story missions which tend to be slower paced and will have you off to see a wizard who needs to recloak the inn, or to destroy an enchanted bell on the city ramparts before a sorcerer can use it to spread madness, or simply blowing a horn to alert the town that it's under attack.
You don't want to be done there.
All in all, you end up with 7 story missions and 6 side missions. More than enough content to justify the price point. While you are incentivized to play the story missions for loot reasons, I'd say there isn't a particularly weak mission in the pack. There are some times when I just want to slog through a horde for a while. On completing a mission, or failing and choosing to retire, the party is transported back to the inn to begin the process again. Part of the game's challenge comes from the game's special rats, which work much like Left 4 Dead's special infected. They are spawned in semi-regularly to increase the difficulty and inspire team play, as certain rats require you to be saved by your teammates. Both the gutter runner and the pack rat will cause the victim to be helpless, requiring aid from a teammate, while the globadier and rattling gunner deny space. And then there is of course the rat ogre. He punches things. The mix comes together to create an antagonist cast which inspires the group to remain close but not too close, which makes for an entertaining dynamic. There are some fairness issues, however, with the way that these rats are spawned from time to time. On rare and brutal occasions, the game will choose to spawn some absurd combinations like 3 gutter runners at the same time, or 2 packmasters and a globadier. Combinations of opponents that when striking together incapacitate most of the party in a single blow. Games like Left 4 Dead had safeguards in place to prevent absurdities such as this. There is also a diversity to the common rats, but the important common rats are the storm vermin, who when showing up alone are manageable, but occasionally march through the city in numbers. These patrols can either be hidden from or fought. Storm vermin are heavily armored, and unless you have an armor-piercing weapon or the ability to set them on fire, you will struggle to handle more than one at a time. Speaking of armor piercing, let's talk about the options you have in killing rats, because not all characters can use all the weapons that you find. If you're playing the Imperial Soldier or the Dwarf, you'll be out in front using huge two-handed weapons to sweep hordes to one side, or shoving them back with a sword and board. Even as these classes, you still have a ranged secondary, but they're not quite as useful as the Elf's Bow or the Wizard's Staff. The Elf and the Ember Mage benefit from having a little bit of space to breathe, and while they can hold their own when it comes to close combat, they excel at clearing out special rats from a safer distance, or removing masses of rats in a single burst of flame from relative safety. The Witch Hunter seems to play in between these two lines, using his ranged weapons for a sudden burst of damage while being able to hold his own with his primary melee. Your equipment comes from a persistent loot system. After each completed mission, the game rolls a set of weighted dice to determine what piece of loot you'll receive from a randomly generated table. The more dice land in your favor, the better the gear you receive. And the higher the difficulty, the better loot you will be rolling for. There are 5 difficulty levels, and within most story missions, there are means to increase the difficulty further to weigh the dice in your favor. It is of note that if you do not have experience with melee combat games or Left 4 Dead, this game is difficult. I could not complete a mission on normal when I first booted up this game, even with my friend on Skype. There's no shame in playing through on easy, but that was on the first day of release. Now that the game's community has had time to learn, I see people playing their first games on normal with me and things go fine. There are enough people with strong fundamentals and gear that the first time players can be guided along normal without much trouble. However, hard is still hard, and a brand new player will drag down a team. It is a difficulty that requires that all players know the level layouts and how to hide from storm vermin patrols, especially when you're not armed with explosives. Nightmare is, well, an absolute nightmare. I've tried and failed to get through any missions on that difficulty, and I haven't touched Cataclysm. There are 3 ways to bias the dice in your favor on most story missions. One is getting lucky. Opening chests or killing sack rats will sometimes yield improved loot die. The second is by collecting the 3 tomes. These tomes appear in the same place on each map and when picked up occupy the health item slot, forcing healing to be used where it's found. Lastly, there are the grimoires, which are more hidden than tomes and sometimes require quite a bit of doing to get to. They occupy the consumable buff slot and reduce the health of every person in the party by 25%. There are 2 in each level, and they can make it quite challenging to finish a level even on difficulties that are normally quite comfortable. Each book will enhance one of the 7 dice that you roll at the end of the level, and they add an interesting tension to each run. If you're truly having no luck with the rolls, you can melt down 5 items of any rarity to produce one of the rarity above it, so there is at least some form of guaranteed progression. I've been positive about this game thus far, but I must say that this game is not without its flaws. Fat Shark is a small studio that typically doesn't make games of this scale or style, and it shows. It seems from some forum posts that this game was the studio's dying breath, but it has instead been revitalizing. They are reeling from the release, and while they are making progress, I must review the game in the state that it's in. The majority of my bug complaints come from the packmasters, who are a true terror for the wrong reasons. My friend has been hooked through the floor, I have been dragged into impossible to reach positions. It might hook someone and then momentarily become invisible, or make the person it hooked become invisible, in that critical moment when you have to save them. Now, this typically doesn't end the game or inflict critical damage to the party, but it is a bother. The developers are aware of the game's problems and they are working on it. The company's forum presence states that their level designers are working on fixing level exploits. For example, that there are certain planks that confuse the enemy AI and cause them not to attack during holdout sections, and the coders are hard at work trying to figure it out why it is that the rat ogre doesn't have a clue how to get down off of a street lamp, or why it is that he slides around without animation after swinging at an adventurer. Also, you can hear the mic of a person loading in even if they are not meaning to transmit audio. I think it might only affect the host of the session though, I'm unsure. Now, bugs are scary. But let me assure you that even with the bugs, this is a game worth playing. These bugs are immersion breaking, but largely amusing and only occasionally devastating. I can't tell you what $30 means to you, but I don't regret the expense in the slightest, and given the success of the game, I imagine that Fat Shark will sort out these issues in time. As of the recording of this review, I'm 40 hours into this game, and I don't intend to stop until either Nightmare or Cataclysm beats me into a pulp. The basic gameplay loop is fun, every success is rewarded, and it feels like there's always a chance that the next run will yield something amazing. The way that you can adjust the difficulty on the fly by deciding to pick up grimoires keeps runs engaging, and hope-filled. I have found that some weapons are more useful than others, but the more difficulties I delve into, the more reasons I see to use different weapons. I have spent most of my time with the game on Skype with a friend, but in the 15 or so hours I played without him, I have had more positive experiences in the community than negative. Yes, there are some people who are wieners, but there is no friendly fire until you get to Nightmare. And still you have the ability to kick or mute players spamming chat with unwanted content. More frequently, I've been taught by individuals, showing me how to reach sneaky grimoire locations and teaching me the best way to survive holdout sections. A surprising number of people have mics, though few of them will use them if not prompted. For the $30 price tag, there's a lot of game here. The mission variety is strong, the flavor of Warhammer running through the concoction is delicious, despite my ignorance of the subject. Voice acting and sound are a joy to my ears. The bugs are the only part of this game that makes it feel like a small team made this. Sometimes I wish for a more conventional menu system instead of being dropped back into the inn, but there's so much character to the inn, and a hefty dose of flavor even in the inn's rooms. The various survivors have made themselves cozy and done up their living spaces to their particular likings, which is a well-crafted touch. Admittedly, the loot system leads to grinding, and if you don't want to switch characters, it can be frustrating to get gear for other classes when you feel like you've found your niche. But this is all core to the system's success in convincing me to return again and again, pushing myself to higher difficulties instead of stalling out at normal. The loot system has driven me to complete hard, and I am gearing up to attempt nightmare. I do not begrudge the system its randomness, even when I miss powerful item drops for Kruger or the Dwarf, because it gives me a reason to keep playing this game that I'm having a grand time with. If this game sounds interesting to you, then know that I highly recommend that you give this game some dollars and a look.